Well, I traveled around a lot when I was growing up. So I'm originally from the East Coast, but only until I was like 9 or 10. And then I lived overseas for a number of years. And my dad is German. And so because we were living overseas and his mother and family was in Germany, we would do a lot of traveling every summer and go and visit my Oma. Which led to the first Bob Dylan show that I went to in 1981 when I was 15 years old.
Where was that?
That was in Mannheim, Germany.
In
And
1981.
I had been a music fan. I don't know. I've always loved music, and my parents always had music in the house. They had a record player, and I would say they probably had a mix of kind of, a lot of the popular music of the day crossing different genres. And so they really liked to listen to show tunes, and they were big fans of like the Great American Songbook, Frank Sinatra in particular. But then they had other random things. And the first record I remember ever really gravitating to when I was young, like 4 or 5, was this Roger Miller Greatest Hits record that they had. And I loved that. I would put that on the record player. And I remember I would actually, like, once I got to know the songs really well, I would pretend that I was like at a concert and that he was singing, and I would sing along. And so I don't know, it's just always been something that's in my genes, I guess, even though it's not really, my family itself isn't really musical. They were never musicians. And that, sort of level of fandom just kind of continued as I, went through different things. So I had a giant Neil Diamond craze when I was like in 3rd through maybe 5th grade, and collected all his records. And, then gradually started getting into some of the, sort of classic rock stuff. So my first favorite rock bands were the Stones and Jethro Tull, which they're kind of divergent, but I don't know why. I just liked both of those. And then, so back to the 1981 in Germany, like I have a brother who's less than 2 years older than me. And we were both kind of starting to get into that genre of like 60s and 70s music. And we were in Mannheim where my Oma lived. And we were walking down the street one day, and there was a, fence plastered with Bob Dylan in concert posters. This is how the advertising was then. There was no internet, or there were probably some fanzines that I was too young to know about, And so we convinced, it didn't take a lot of convincing, got my parents to get us tickets and to actually drop us off at the stadium in the morning. So we were among the first people in line. And it's funny, like, I don't remember it like this, but I was talking to my brother about the day a few years ago, and according to him, it was all me who wanted to be in the front row. And I don't even know why. Like, I sort of knew Bob Dylan and I wanted to see him because I liked what I heard, but I didn't have some like super, super like fandom about him at that point. But something just needed to be in the front row. And so it was a giant hockey stadium, and I'll remember they let us in. And my brother, I guess, had tried to talk us out of this because he's like, it's going to be too crowded down there and we're never going to make it, and we should just get a good seat in the stands. And I was like, have none of that. And so we dashed in there. And so for my very first show in 1981, we were front and center on the rail. And that changed me. Like, after that, I was a big Bob Dylan fan. A few of the thoughts that I remember going into that concert are really funny. Like, I knew vaguely that somebody, I think maybe like some friends of my brother, had told us in months before that Bob had become like a Christian, like a religious freak. And so like that was his thing now. So I knew that. And I do remember thinking, like, I hope he plays some songs I know, which were kind of the greatest hits type stuff. But I don't remember being overly concerned about that. And then the other thing I really remember thinking is, I'm really glad that we're getting to see Bob Dylan, because it'll probably be the last time that we'll be able to, because he's pretty old. It was 81, so he had gone back to playing his older songs, and it was about half and half. It was about half, stuff from Saved and Blood on the Tracks, or maybe even more like 2/3 stuff from not Blood on the Tracks. I'm sorry, Slow Train. I pictured train tracks. It was about 2/3, Saved and Slow Train and Shot of Love, which hadn't even come out. And he played Watered Down Love and Lenny Bruce and Heart of Mine and a couple others from that, which wasn't even released yet. And then, classics. So Just Like a Woman and It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. But the very first song I heard Bob ever perform live was Saved. That's what he came out with. Awesome. So it was cool. Yeah. And I mean, the band is like top notch then. And he had the lady singers and it was just powerful. And I just, it was a long time ago, obviously. So details are not crystal clear, but some of them are. Like, I just can remember the feeling of standing there looking at him and, certain songs, the way the lighting was, and it had a big impact on me and I wanted to see more. The thing that I know really grabbed me about Bob Dylan more than anybody else, the first times I heard him was his voice and his singing. And so I never understand when people are like, well, I love his writing, but I just can't take listening to him. Like, to me, the two are inextricably connected, and he is the best singer, bar none, of anybody. And that voice like shot through me the very first time I heard him. And, of course, there's so many different voices that he uses, but something about his delivery and the way he sings was probably what hooked me first. And he's just so unusual, like just his phrasing and, things that I don't think I consciously thought about when I first heard him sing, but I know that it was like different than anything else. And then, of course, just the whole ability, the journey with Bob, and getting to know his back catalog from whenever, you come to him as a fan, there's like so much to learn and discover. And that was just, endlessly fascinating to me. It's funny, actually, like right after that first concert, I was all of a sudden like, several notches more up into Bob. And so I wanted to start getting his records that had been released. And I remember the very first one that I bought, it might actually have been in Germany before we left on that vacation. We were walking down the street and there was a record store and my dad was like, all right, go and you can each pick out one album. And I remember they had a like display of At Budokan, and it was on sale or something. And so I was like, all right, I want that one. It's double album and it's like the most recent live album that he's done. And I had just seen him live. So I thought, okay, I want to I want to be able to relive that live experience that I just had because that was so good. And then I put that on and I'm like, what the hell? Like, this is so different, but I loved it. But it just like that kind of clicked on an additional light in my brain. Like, wow, this guy is a weirdo, like in the best of ways, like how creative and how like, and then you go back and I think maybe the next thing I bought was Another Side of Bob Dylan, which is totally different and so great in another way. So, I mean, of course, there have been shows that I have not been in the front row for, whatever reasons, but I mean, and the fact that I was so hell-bent on getting there before I had even had that experience makes me just really think that it's some, well, I was thinking back to like Toby Thompson. I was listening to your thing with him earlier today and he calls it a pathology. I think I've called it more like a shared affliction that a lot of us like rail riders have. But I mean, I love it there. Yeah. And I always want to be there for my favorite bands. When I moved back to the States and moved to Michigan at that time, and was in high school, I would start going to see Bob whenever he would come around. And I lived in the Detroit area. So that was basically once a year. And he would play at a small outdoor amphitheater just north of Detroit on the Oakland University campus. And he would play there every summer. And a lot of summers he would do 2 shows. And so my best friend in high school and I would always go. And then continuing on to my first few years of college. So one summer, I know it was the summer of 1988, he did 2 nights at this Meadowbrook Music Theater. And my friend and I were poor. And so it was one of these places with the seats were all close and the lawn in the back. And so we got for both nights, we got the lawn for the first night. And then we got some seats in the stands for the second night. Went to the first night and it was great. I remember loving it, but I remember this angsty feeling of like, I'm so far away, like it's just not the same. And there's this big distance, in between me and Bob or whatever. So, but we had seats the second night and they were decent. I think they were, if I remember correctly, maybe around 15th row or so. And we sat through most of the concert. It was a great concert. I remember he played Frankie Lee and Judas Priest that night, which was an unusual thing. But then it got towards the end of the show and I was like super antsy and I was like, looked at my friend and I was like, we got to get closer. And we'd taken some mushrooms too. So I think I felt like kind of invincible or like, there was nothing stopping us. And so a couple songs before the end, we started like working our way down to the stage. And I don't know why we didn't get stopped by security. Maybe it was the shrooms. I don't know. We had some protective aura. And maybe we were kind of scooting into the aisles, like on the edge and then making sure security wasn't looking at us. And we did that until like the last song before the encore, we just walked like right up to the lip of the stage with the front row, just behind us. And Bob saw us and he was playing like a Rolling Stone. And then like once we did that, a few other brave souls started to kind of filter out and stand up towards the end. And during like a Rolling Stone, he was coming like right to the edge of the stage and doing like all these rock star poses at me and my friend and singing like, how does it feel, like right in our faces, to the point where everybody was like, oh my God, he's singing to you. And what a trip. Like that's the first time Bob looked at me or noticed me. And that is something that makes you feel kind of like infinite and scared and freaked out and like ecstatic at the same time. And I think he kind of got a kick out of us because I was pretty young still then, when it was 88. So I was just like 20, 21. And I think for the audience, we were probably pretty young. I don't know that there was like a giant amount of people our age then. I think maybe more young people go see Bob now maybe than in the mid 80s. But I think he kind of got a kick out of us and sort of just the audacity of us walking down there. So that was like mind blowing. I just remember I was high off of that for like 2 weeks. It's like all I could think about, like, oh my God, Bob Dylan sang to me. So I think that made me never not want to be in the front row for a Bob Dylan show again. I think one thing that's been a common thread that is a song that I really have a kind of photographic memory of for whatever reason from that very first show, and has always been a really special song to me when it's been played, is It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. I think that was like my very first favorite Bob Dylan song, like even, before I had seen him that time. And then he played it that night. And there's just been, moments that I can think of, like the first New Orleans Jazz Fest I went to in 2003, where that song was the highlight for me. And then just other songs, down the years. But then my other answer to that would be possibly the year 2004. Like that was the year that I saw the most Bob shows. I think I went to 48 shows that year. And he was just playing he was playing like a lot of multiple nights at small theaters. Like, and that was when he was doing like, he played 4 nights in Chicago and each night got consecutively smaller. Like he started at the Aragon Ballroom, a couple thousand people, and it went down to the Park West, which is like 400 people. And he was just playing all these weird little venues. And they were all GA, and they were all like, that's when he like broke out Hazel, and just like show after show that spring and early summer was probably my favorite Bob Dylan tour. One of my favorite Bob songs is in his entire catalog is I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You. And the reason is that to me, people say, oh, what a beautiful love song about, to a woman. That's a love song to his fans. I thought that the second that I heard it, and he has given himself to us in terms of his like traveling troubadour self, you know, from Salt Lake City to San Antonio. I don't know. I feel like my Bob Dylan fandom has had these moments where it gets like, it's always been pretty constant and pretty big since I first listened to him. But there's these moments that are kind of like, kick it up a notch even more. And one of those times for me actually was around the release of Love and Theft in 2001 and the live shows that I saw that year, which were just the hometown shows in Michigan. Or maybe I traveled to one other one, but I just, though, like that era of Bob, that '01, '02 just was so phenomenal to me. And I know a lot of people agree with this too. I mean, it was just such a great band and having those new songs for the first time in a long time. And then he was also doing like those, you know, kind of bluegrassy spirituals like Hummingbird and I Am the Man Thomas, like all those weird songs. Like just the whole package of that era of Bob was just really great to me. And after I saw a few of those shows, it kind of, like I said, kind of kicked me into high gear. And that's actually really the time that I started traveling to go see Bob more than I ever had before. And so 2002 is when I met Kate. And it's funny, you know, it's like, I don't know, I think different people maybe have different experiences with it. For me, I don't feel like there's anybody that I met in line for a Bob Dylan show that it was like an immediate gushing of affection and bond, partly because like, especially back then, and especially with GA shows, I was pretty tense and intense, you know, like I was there for the mission of being in front of Bob Dylan. I was traveling solo. I was pretty like introverted. And so while I would kind of make, you know, some small talk with people, it was kind of hard to like not be just focused on sitting there and thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to see Bob Dylan in 2 hours or whatever. And then there's also what's not, you know, a little bit of competition there, like, you know, and so I remember seeing Kate, this like really pretty girl who was also always on the rail. And sometimes I think I had seen her side stage with Tommy, you know, like it's kind of like, I'm the rail girl here, you know? So I saw her around. And then the first show that we talked at was in Ohio, and it was at, I was at one show in Ohio where I'd given a mutual friend of ours had driven with me. And so that was kind of the end to talking to her. And, you know, we chatted a little bit. And then the next show, the next day was in Kent, Ohio. And she had a bottle of some sort. She had a bottle of champagne, I think, for some reason. And then she like, and she offered me some. So then, you know, we broke bread together. And then we were like, okay, this person's pretty cool. And I saw her at, you know, a few consecutive shows till by the end of that fall 2002 tour. I think the last shows that we were at together maybe were like Pittsburgh or something like that. We exchanged info, we exchanged phone numbers, and pretty quickly decided that we would drive to the last show of that tour together, which was Charlie's last show. Yep. So in Fairfax, Virginia. And, you know, then we were just fast friends. And I think we quickly, I remember her saying to me early on, like, you're the first person that I've ever met who thinks of Bob in the same way that I do. For all of what that means, you know, like there was definitely a bond. And we pretty quickly decided that if Bob's next tour, so spring 2003, was in the US, that we would go to every show, and we did.